On a cold January evening in 1980, in a rented apartment in Laurel, Maryland, Ronald William Pelton sat alone at a kitchen table with an empty bottle of bourbon beside him and a telephone directory open in front of him. The temperature outside had dropped below freezing. The apartment was sparsely furnished. Rental furniture, a kitchen table, a chair. He had been drinking since some time in the early afternoon, which had become, by that point in his life, a not unusual way to spend an evening. He was 38 years old. He had worked for the National Security Agency for 14 years. He had been out of work for nearly 5 months. Whatever remained in his checking account would be seized by creditors before the month was out. His marriage was deteriorating in the slow, grinding way that financial desperation produces, not in dramatic confrontations, but in silences, in the careful avoidance of certain subjects, in the accumulation of small resentments that had no larger outlet. His house had been sold at a loss the year before, and somewhere in the bourbon-softened region of his thinking, where decisions are made before a person has fully committed to them, he had arrived at an idea he had been circling for weeks. Before we continue, if you are fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let us talk about the analyst who sold the United States government's most valuable signals intelligence operation for $35,000. He found the number he was looking for, lifted the receiver, and dialed the main switchboard of the Embassy of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on Wisconsin Avenue in northwest Washington, D.C. The call connected. A duty officer answered. What Ronald Pelton said in the next 20 minutes would not be fully known to American investigators for another 5 years. When it was known, it would represent one of the most consequential acts of espionage in the history of American signals intelligence. It would compromise a program that had taken a decade and hundreds of millions of dollars to develop. It would hand the Soviet Union the physical proof of the most sophisticated underwater intelligence collection operation the United States had ever mounted. It would ultimately cost Ronald Pelton everything that he had told himself the phone call might save. He received, in exchange for all of it, approximately $35,000. Ronald William Pelton had been born on July 24th, 1941, in Denver, Colorado. His father had worked as an electrician, and his mother had worked in retail during the lean years. By accounts gathered from teachers and former neighbors during the FBI investigation that followed Pelton's identification in late 1985, Ronald had been an intellectually restless child, impatient with routine schoolwork, capable of remarkable focus when a subject captured his interest. Mathematics had come easily to him. Languages had come even more easily. He had a facility with pattern recognition, with decoding structure out of apparent chaos, with the kind of abstract spatial reasoning that allowed him to understand, intuitively, how systems worked. These qualities, which would eventually define the shape of his professional life, were evident early enough that multiple high school teachers had identified him as someone whose abilities required more than conventional schooling could provide. He attended Indiana University after high school. He studied electrical engineering, and as an elective interest that gradually became as serious as his major, foreign languages, Russian in particular. He did not complete his undergraduate degree, a fact that would surface in the biographical summaries published at the time of his trial without the explanatory context that would make it meaningful. His departure from Indiana University appears to have been less a failure than a practical redirection. By the mid-1960s, the United States intelligence community was actively recruiting young people with precisely the combination of technical ability and language aptitude that Pelton possessed, and the formal credential of a degree was not a firm requirement for entry-level positions. In 1965, at the age of 23, Ronald Pelton applied for employment at the National Security Agency. The application process was extensive. The NSA's hiring procedures in the mid-1960s involved background investigations that scrutinized every significant relationship, financial history, prior employment, and personal association of the applicant. The process typically took months. Investigators interviewed former employers, neighbors, college professors, and personal acquaintances. They reviewed financial records, foreign travel, and any contact with nationals of adversary countries. The purpose was to identify vulnerabilities, anything in a person's background that might make them susceptible to coercion or recruitment by a foreign intelligence service. Pelton's investigation found nothing of concern. He was financially stable, personally unremarkable in all the ways that security reviews valued, and professionally well suited to the kind of work the agency needed. He was, by the measures available to investigators in 1965, exactly the kind of person the NSA should hire. His clearance was granted initially at the secret level, and then, after a probationary period and additional vetting, at the top secret level. He was subsequently granted access to sensitive compartmented information, a designation above top secret that applied to the most restricted categories of intelligence programs, where compartmentalization meant that access to one program did not necessarily confer knowledge of any other. He was assigned to signals intelligence operations, specifically to work involving communications intelligence, the collection, processing, and analysis of intercepted foreign communications. He worked within the bureaucratic structure of an organization that was, in the mid-1960s, in the midst of a period of dramatic expansion. The NSA had grown from a modest signals intelligence operation in the early 1950s into an organization that employed tens of thousands of people, operated collection facilities on multiple continents and in orbit, and consumed a classified budget that dwarfed any other component of the American intelligence community. Its headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by antennas and secured by multiple perimeters, was known within the intelligence world as the Puzzle Palace. Its existence was so classified that it was not publicly acknowledged by the United States government until the early 1970s. Among people who knew of it but were not supposed to acknowledge its existence, the initials NSA were sometimes said to stand for no such agency. Pelton worked within this world for 14 years. The daily reality of that work was, for most of those who performed it, considerably less dramatic than the organization's reputation might suggest. Much of signals intelligence work consisted of methodical, analytical labor, reviewing intercepts, identifying patterns in communications traffic, categorizing raw signals against target descriptions, preparing reports, and contributing individual pieces to a very large collective puzzle. Employees arrived at Fort Meade each morning through security gates, deposited personal items in lockers outside classified spaces, and spent their days in buildings where the windows were frosted, the telephone systems were separated from public networks, and conversation about the nature of one's specific work was understood to end at the perimeter fence. It was, in the way of many government jobs, simultaneously consequential and routine. Pelton's specific assignments over those 14 years are not fully documented in publicly available records. The nature of his work remained classified even after his prosecution. What is known from the damage assessment prepared by the NSA after his arrest, and from his own statements during FBI debriefings, is that his career trajectory had given him exposure to a range of the agency's most sensitive programs. He had not remained in one narrow specialty. He had moved, as his experience and reputation grew, into areas of greater sensitivity and broader scope. By the mid-1970s, Pelton was a senior communications intelligence analyst with access to compartmented programs that represented some of the most consequential intelligence collection operations the United States had ever mounted. He attended classified briefings. He reviewed operational materials that most of the people around him at Fort Meade were not authorized to see. He knew what the agency could intercept, what it could not, which technical vulnerabilities in Soviet communication systems were being exploited, and which had thus far been missed or left alone. He knew the methods, the sources, and crucially, the current operations that were collecting intelligence in ways the Soviets believed to be impossible. What made Pelton particularly valuable and particularly dangerous, as events would prove, was the breadth of his exposure relative to the depth of his specific assignments. The NSA's compartmentalization procedures were designed precisely to prevent any one employee from assembling a complete picture of the agency's collection capabilities. A person who knew about one program should not, by design, know about another in an unrelated area. But the practical reality of a large intelligence organization is that people accumulate context over time. A communication specialist who works adjacent to a collection program for years absorbs operational knowledge that was never explicitly disclosed to them. A senior analyst who attends briefings across multiple compartments over a decade begins to see connections that were never intended to be visible from any single vantage point. By 1979, when Pelton left the NSA, he carried in his memory a picture of American SIGINT capabilities that was broader than his formal access records would have suggested, assembled not from any single moment of unauthorized access, but from 14 years of work at the intersection of multiple programs. His life outside the classified world of Fort Meade was the ordinary life of a suburban Maryland government employee with a family and a modest income. He and Karen, whom he had married in the late 1960s, had settled into a house in the Maryland suburbs. They had children. Accounts from neighbors, later interviewed by the FBI, described Pelton as a generally unremarkable presence in the neighborhood, someone who mowed his lawn, washed his car, and attended the occasional block gathering without drawing particular attention. He maintained a workbench in the garage where he repaired electronics as a practical hobby. He drove a domestic car and paid his bills and lived, by all external appearances, the kind of thoroughly conventional suburban life that was neither notable for its contentment nor for its difficulty. The financial picture began to deteriorate at some point in the mid-1970s. The deterioration was gradual rather than sudden, not a single catastrophic event, but an accumulation of obligations and expenditures that exceeded what a government analyst's salary could sustain. Credit card accounts carried balances that grew from month to month. Personal loans were taken to cover existing obligations, which then became new obligations. The late 1970s inflationary environment, which squeezed household finances across the American middle class and which hit families carrying significant debt with particular force, compounded the problem. By 1978, Pelton was behind on multiple accounts. In 1979, he filed for bankruptcy, listing debts of approximately $65,000 against negligible assets. The house was sold at a loss. The family relocated to a rental property. His NSA career ended that same year. Whether the financial situation was the primary cause of his departure or one factor among several was never conclusively established, but the coincidence was noted by investigators who later reviewed the timeline. By the summer of 1979, Ronald Pelton was unemployed, had completed a bankruptcy filing, and was in possession of knowledge about some of the most sensitive intelligence programs in the United States government, knowledge he had been trusted, implicitly and by law, never to share. What the NSA's exit procedures in 1979 did not include was any formal mechanism for evaluating the state of mind of departing employees or the financial circumstances they were entering. Pelton left the building at Fort Meade, surrendered his badge, had his access terminated, and departed with a 14-year accumulation of classified knowledge, no continuing oversight from the institution that had created it, and a set of financial obligations that his post-NSA income had no realistic prospect of meeting. The security infrastructure that had been built around him while he was employed simply ceased to apply. He spent the remainder of 1979 attempting to find work in private sector electronics and communications consulting, work that drew on skills developed at the NSA, but that could not be fully explained without reference to classified programs. The work was sporadic and the income inadequate. His marriage, under the pressure of the financial collapse, had not broken, but had become something that functioned through habit and the shared logistics of children, rather than through any active sense of partnership. The drinking, which had been a periodic feature of his private life for some years, became more consistent. By early 1980, he had been without stable employment for 6 months, and the knowledge entrusted to him by the United States government had begun to look in the distorted calculus of his desperation like something that might have a market. The particular psychology of the evening he opened the telephone directory is one that does not reduce easily to a single explanation. He was desperate. He had been drinking. He had, in the way that people under sustained financial pressure sometimes do, gradually redefined the boundaries of what he considered possible. The steady erosion of his financial situation over the preceding years had required a corresponding erosion of other certainties about who he was, about what he would and would not do, about which lines existed and which had already moved. By the time he lifted the receiver, he had been living inside a financial crisis, long enough that the crisis had become the frame through which everything else was evaluated. The question, as he appears to have experienced it, was not whether what he was about to do was right or wrong. The question was whether it might help. The man who answered the Soviet embassy switchboard that evening was a duty officer, an embassy employee whose assignment included handling after-hours incoming calls and managing contacts that might require escalation to intelligence personnel. According to accounts partially reconstructed from KGB documentation that became selectively available after the Soviet Union's dissolution, and from Pelton's own statements in his FBI debriefings, the initial conversation was brief, somewhat incoherent, and imprecise in its specifics. Pelton identified himself by name. He said he had worked for the United States intelligence community. He said he had information that would be of significant value to Soviet intelligence and that he was prepared to discuss terms. He did not, in this initial call, specify his former employer or describe the specific programs he might be prepared to discuss. The duty officer responded with practiced caution. Walk-in contacts claiming to possess intelligence for sale were not uncommon at Soviet diplomatic facilities in Western capitals. Many were the products of mental instability or intoxication. Some were deliberate operations mounted by the FBI or CIA designed to identify vulnerabilities in Soviet intelligence procedures. The duty officer noted Pelton's name, took a contact number, and indicated that someone would be in touch. The KGB did contact him within days. The initial assessment that the contact warranted further evaluation reflected the straightforward logic of recruitment. A former American intelligence employee motivated by financial need was, on its face, exactly the kind of contact that Soviet intelligence had invested years trying to develop. Initial meetings were arranged through indirect means, designed to provide plausible deniability if the approach turned out to be an FBI provocation. A KGB officer from the Washington residency, operating under diplomatic cover, met with Pelton at a location that could be characterized as coincidental if observed. The officer's purpose was assessment. Was Pelton genuine? Did his claimed access match what he described? Pelton, motivated by financial necessity to demonstrate his value quickly, answered the assessment question directly. He told them he had worked for the National Security Agency. He specified that his access had extended to sensitive compartmented information programs. He offered to discuss the nature of those programs in exchange for payment. The skepticism within the KGB's Washington residency did not survive this disclosure. A walk-in from the National Security Agency, a former employee with SCI access, who was demonstrably motivated by financial desperation and who appeared to be acting without any organizational preparation, was exactly the kind of asset that Soviet intelligence valued most. The residency moved the case to a formal operational footing. What Ronald Pelton knew, what he began to describe to his KGB handlers over the course of early 1980, was, even in fragments and partial disclosures, an intelligence resource of extraordinary value. He had, over 14 years at the NSA, accumulated knowledge of the architecture of American signals intelligence collection, which programs existed, which targets they addressed, what methods they employed, and what their limitations were. He knew which Soviet communications channels were being monitored and which had thus far evaded collection. He knew the organizational structures responsible for specific programs and the classification frameworks that protected them. But the single most consequential piece of information Pelton possessed, the disclosure that would eventually give his case its defining significance in the history of Cold War espionage, was his knowledge of a program called Operation Ivy Bells. The Ivy Bells program had begun in the early 1970s as a joint undertaking between the National Security Agency and the United States Navy, with participation from other elements of the intelligence community in evaluation and planning. Its purpose was to place a listening device directly on a Soviet military communications cable running along the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk, a semi-enclosed body of water lying between the Kamchatka Peninsula and the Soviet Pacific coast. The cable carried encrypted military communications between the Soviet Pacific Fleet's primary shore command facilities and the operational units of the fleet distributed across the Pacific theater. It was, from a signals intelligence perspective, one of the most valuable single communications channels in the Soviet military network. The Soviets had chosen underwater cable as the medium for this communications route because they believed, reasonably, that a cable buried in ocean sediment at depth was inaccessible to interception. Radio communications could be captured by anyone with appropriate receivers. A cable in remote waters, patrolled by Soviet naval forces, appeared to offer security that radio could not. The Soviet assessment was logical. It was also wrong. The story of how American intelligence identified the cable's existence and approximate location is itself a measure of the analytical creativity the NSA was capable of. Soviet naval procedure required that sections of the cable be marked to warn Soviet fishing and shipping vessels away from anchoring in the cable's path. Along sections of the cable, near the Soviet coastline, warning signs posted in Russian instructed mariners not to anchor due to the presence of an undersea cable. According to accounts that have emerged in declassified reporting and from former officials who worked in the program, an NSA analyst reviewing satellite imagery of the Soviet Pacific coastal region identified these warning signs and reasoned backward from their presence. If the Soviets were marking a cable at this location, a cable existed. Additional signals intelligence about Soviet Pacific Fleet communications patterns helped analysts develop a more precise picture of the cable's probable route and purpose. The collection operation that followed required years of engineering development and extraordinary operational preparation. The United States Navy undertook the conversion of the USS Halibut, a nuclear-powered submarine originally built to carry the Regulus cruise missile but rendered obsolete in that role, into a specialized intelligence collection platform. The conversion was conducted at the highest classification levels. The Halibut was fitted with a pressurized chamber from which Navy divers could exit the submarine at considerable depth using specialized equipment developed specifically for this kind of operation. These were not ordinary Navy divers. They were trained for operations at the depths required by the program, in cold water, in limited visibility, performing precise technical work under time pressure that left almost no margin for the kind of mechanical or human failure that is common in any demanding operational environment. The physical act of descending to the cable, positioning the recording device correctly, and securing it to the cable without cutting it, and without creating any electrical disturbance detectable at either terminus, required the kind of operational precision that years of training and specialized equipment could make achievable, but could not make routine. The recording device ultimately developed for Ivy Bells was, by accounts from individuals with knowledge of the program who have spoken in the decades since its exposure, a substantial piece of engineering, large enough that the divers required specialized handling equipment to maneuver it correctly at depth. It was constructed to attach to the cable using an inductive coupling mechanism that could read the electrical signals passing through the cable without any direct electrical connection, leaving no physical trace detectable from the cable's operating terminals. The device recorded communications continuously onto tape and was powered by a nuclear isotope energy source in its earliest iterations, a decision that provided reliable long-term power supply under conditions where no alternative power source was feasible, at the cost of certain operational considerations that were carefully evaluated before each deployment. The operational pattern of Ivy Bells required submarine returns to the Sea of Okhotsk at intervals of approximately 6 to 8 weeks. On each return, Navy divers would exit the Halibut and later the USS Parche, which took over the collection mission, descend to the device, remove the tape reels that had been recording since the previous visit, replace them with fresh ones, and return the full recordings to the submarine for transport to the United States. Those recordings were processed by NSA analysts, decrypted where possible using methods that drew on other intelligence programs, and distributed through the intelligence community's established product channels to military and policy consumers who did not always know precisely where the intelligence had originated. The intelligence they produced, Soviet Pacific Fleet operational communications delivered in their raw form, before encoding changes that might obscure their content, provided American military and intelligence planners with direct insight into Soviet naval operations that no other collection method could have produced. The program ran successfully for approximately a decade. Estimates of the total investment, from the submarine conversions through the specialized equipment development, the operational costs, and the processing infrastructure, consistently reach figures in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Some assessments place the cumulative cost higher still, particularly when the strategic value of the intelligence produced was factored into the accounting. Pelton told the KGB about all of it. He described the program's existence and its purpose. He described its geographic location in the Sea of Okhotsk and the nature of the communications cable being tapped. He described the recording device and its general operational principles, the inductive coupling approach, the tape recording system, the nuclear power source. He described the operational pattern of submarine returns and tape exchanges. He could not provide the precise coordinates of the device. That level of operational detail was not within his specific knowledge, but what he provided was sufficient for Soviet naval intelligence to mount a targeted search of a defined geographic area. In 1981, a Soviet research vessel dispatched to the Sea of Okhotsk, equipped with specialized underwater search equipment, located the recording device. Soviet naval personnel retrieved it from the seabed and brought it to the surface. The device was transported to Moscow. The Ivy Bells program was terminated. The recording device is reportedly on display at the FSB Museum in Moscow, a physical artifact of what espionage, at its most consequential, can destroy. The immediate operational consequence was clear. The communications intelligence that had flowed from the program stopped in 1981. American analysts who had been working with a steady stream of Soviet Pacific Fleet communications found themselves without a source that no other collection method could replicate. What the intelligence community could assess only indirectly was the second-order effect, how the Soviet Pacific Fleet had adjusted its communications practices in the months and years following the device's recovery. Changes in encryption, in communications routing, in the frequency and content of cable versus radio communications. All of these were observable indicators that the Soviets were acting on what they had learned. Whether those changes were driven specifically by the Ivy Bells recovery or by broader communication security improvements was not always possible to determine. What was certain was that a channel that had been extraordinarily productive was now producing nothing, and that the absence of intelligence is itself a form of damage that resists easy quantification. Pelton's relationship with his KGB handlers continued to develop over the years following the initial contact and the Ivy Bells disclosure. Direct meetings on American soil were considered operationally unacceptable. The Soviet intelligence community's experience in Washington had given them a sophisticated understanding of the extent and capability of FBI surveillance of Soviet embassy personnel and their known contacts. The relationship was instead managed through international travel. The substantive meetings between Pelton and his handlers took place primarily in Vienna, Austria, a city that served throughout the Cold War as preferred neutral ground for intelligence operations of both sides. Its geographic centrality and long tradition of diplomatic ambiguity making it accessible without the heightened counterintelligence environment of Washington or Moscow. According to records and testimony assembled during the prosecution, Pelton traveled to Vienna at least twice for extended meetings with KGB officers. The meetings in Vienna followed a pattern consistent with KGB asset handling procedures, documented in materials that became partially available after the Soviet Union's dissolution. Pelton was given specific instructions in advance. a hotel, a room number, a time. The establishments used were mid-range business hotels, the kind that attracted international travelers without the elevated security profile of major luxury properties or the visible diplomatic associations of institutions known to serve the embassies. The KGB officers who received him in Vienna were not the junior personnel who had managed the initial Washington contact, but senior handlers whose manner conveyed, without stating it explicitly, that the Soviet side understood precisely what it was receiving. The meetings were conducted in hotel rooms, with prepared questions developed by analysts in Moscow who had reviewed Pelton's initial disclosures and determined what additional technical detail was needed to make the intelligence operationally useful. Pelton answered those questions. He did not attempt to withhold information by category or to negotiate the scope of what he would discuss. According to the reconstruction available from court records and his own later statements, he provided what was asked. The financial transactions that concluded each meeting were conducted in cash. According to the accounting reconstructed during the FBI investigation, Pelton received his payments in envelopes, the contents counted in front of him before the meeting concluded. He placed the envelopes in his jacket and flew back to the United States, carrying the cash in amounts that did not trigger customs declaration requirements. He returned to the ordinary rhythms of a civilian life that remained financially precarious, spending the money on the immediate needs that had motivated the original contact, paying down the most pressing debt, covering living expenses, managing the practical daily costs of a family that was still underwater. The other programs Pelton described during the Vienna meetings were, by the FBI and NSA damage assessment completed after his arrest, collectively significant in ways that compounded the damage done by I.V. Bells. He had provided an outline of NSA collection methods that helped Soviet analysts understand where their own communications were vulnerable to interception, and by inference, where they were not. He had described certain signals intelligence programs aimed at Soviet military and governmental communications that, once identified by the Soviet side, could be modified, moved to alternative channels, or encrypted differently. He had provided, according to the damage assessment, what amounted to a partial map of American SIGINT capabilities and blind spots in the late 1970s, information whose value to Soviet communications security planning was difficult to quantify precisely but was by any estimate significant. He received, across all meetings and all transactions with Soviet intelligence over the course of several years, approximately $35,000. He did not invest it, he did not save it in any form that the subsequent investigation could locate. By the time he was identified in 1985, the money was entirely gone. The I.V. Bells loss in 1981 triggered an extensive but ultimately unsuccessful counterintelligence investigation within the NSA and FBI. The intelligence community understood that the recovery of the recording device had not been the product of accidental Soviet discovery through their own ocean floor survey work. The Sea of Okhotsk was vast. The device was not actively transmitting any recoverable signal, and the probability of chance discovery by a routine Soviet operation was low enough to constitute impossibility. The device had been found because someone had told the Soviets where to look. The investigation that followed examined the compartmentalization of I.V. Bells, who had known of the program's existence, which employees had had access to, which specific details, whether any unusual behavior had been recorded in the vicinity of anyone with relevant access. The universe of people with sufficient knowledge to have enabled the compromise was not enormous, but it was not small enough to permit rapid narrowing. Pelton appeared within that universe. So did others. The investigation could build a circumstantial picture, but could not produce the evidence necessary to move from suspicion to action against any specific individual. By 1983, the investigation had been reduced to a holding pattern. The program was finished. The source had apparently not been identified in the act, and had not made the kind of subsequent mistake, an unexplained financial windfall, an implausible foreign contact, an inconsistency in testimony that might have revealed them. The counterintelligence file remained open. The source remained unidentified. The 4 years between the Ivy Bell's loss in 1981 and Yurchenko's defection in 1985 were, from Pelton's perspective, years in which the immediate crisis had passed without producing the catastrophe he might have feared. He had received his payments. He had returned from Vienna. He had resumed the ordinary rhythms of his diminished civilian life. Whatever anxiety the initial contact and the subsequent meetings had produced had apparently not been sustained at a level that produced behavioral changes observable to the people around him. He had compartmentalized the espionage from the rest of his life with sufficient effectiveness to avoid detection for 5 years. This period of undiscovered operation was itself significant from a counterintelligence perspective. It demonstrated that the KGB's operational security in handling Pelton, the use of Vienna for meetings, the cash payments, the absence of any electronic communication that might be intercepted, had been effective. It also demonstrated that an individual with the right combination of access, desperation, and willingness to rationalize could operate against the United States intelligence community for years without detection, provided the adversary handled the relationship with basic professionalism. Then, in August 1985, Vitaly Sergeyevich Yurchenko walked into the American embassy in Rome. Yurchenko was 49 years old, a senior KGB officer with more than 2 decades of experience. His position within Soviet intelligence was senior enough that his defection was immediately recognized as significant. He was transported to the United States within days and placed in a CIA debriefing facility in Northern Virginia, where officers began the systematic process of extracting and evaluating the information he was prepared to provide. Among the matters Yurchenko addressed in his debriefings was the case of a former American intelligence employee who had approached the Soviet embassy in Washington in approximately 1980. He described the person as a former employee of a major American signals intelligence organization, someone who had identified himself by name and who had offered to sell classified information in exchange for payment. He described the person's motivation as financial desperation. He described the initial contact as a walk-in, without organizational preparation or prior Soviet cultivation. He described the nature of what this person had provided, a major American signals intelligence collection program involving undersea cable tapping in the Pacific. He described meetings in Vienna. He did not know the person's real name. The KGB had known him only by a code designation, but the operational details he provided were specific enough to give investigators a clear picture of the circumstances of the recruitment. FBI counterintelligence analysts began working the information against the universe of former employees of the relevant organizations who might match the profile. Someone who had left a major signals intelligence agency around 1979 or 1980, who had experienced financial difficulties severe enough to motivate a walk-in contact, and who had held the compartmented access that Yurchenko's description implied. The analytical process was methodical, applying each filter in sequence against the relevant employment records, bankruptcy filings, travel records, and access documentation. By October 1985, the investigation had focused with high confidence on Ronald William Pelton. He had left the NSA in 1979. He had filed for bankruptcy that same year. His travel records showed international trips consistent with meetings in Vienna during the relevant period. His former access level was consistent with the programs Yurchenko had described being compromised. Then, in early November 1985, the investigation's sole external source removed himself from the equation. Vitaly Yurchenko disappeared from a Georgetown restaurant on the evening of November 2nd, 1985, during a dinner with his CIA handler. He walked to the Soviet embassy. Within days, he was on his way back to the Soviet Union. At a Moscow press conference after his return, he claimed to have been kidnapped by the CIA, a claim widely disbelieved in intelligence circles on both sides, but secondary in importance to the operational reality. The only external witness in the Pelton identification had returned to Soviet custody and was now entirely beyond the reach of any American legal proceeding. The government's case against Pelton would have to be built almost entirely on what Pelton said about himself. That placed extraordinary weight on whatever occurred in the approaching confrontation. the FBI made a decision. They would contact Pelton directly. On November the 24th, 1985, two FBI special agents drove to Ronald Pelton's residence in Annapolis, Maryland. Pelton was 44 years old, working in private sector electronics work, living with Karen in a modest home in the Annapolis area. He answered the door when the agents knocked, received their credentials, and invited them inside with what observers later described as a wariness that had not yet coalesced into alarm. The conversation that followed lasted approximately 4 hours. It was conducted as a non-custodial interview. Pelton was not under arrest, the agents explained, and he was free at any point to decline to answer questions or to end the conversation entirely. The agent's technique was calibrated to encourage disclosure without triggering the defensive response that a more confrontational approach might have produced. Their questions were structured to suggest a degree of prior knowledge, designed to create the impression that Pelton's responses were confirming rather than revealing, that the broad outline of the situation was already established and that his role was simply to provide detail. Pelton's initial responses were careful, measured, offering some things and withholding others. As the conversation continued, and as the agent's manner continued to suggest that the major contours of the situation were already known, something in his manner shifted. Whether it was a calculation that honesty offered better terms than continued resistance, or the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying an enormous secret for 5 years, he began to talk in a way that was no longer evasive. He acknowledged contact with Soviet intelligence. He acknowledged the meetings in Vienna. He discussed the nature of what he had provided. Among the most significant moments in the 4-hour conversation, according to trial records, came when the agents directed the discussion towards signals collection programs involving undersea communications infrastructure. They framed their questions in a way that suggested existing institutional knowledge of the programs involved. Pelton's response, captured clearly on the recording that agents were maintaining, was to confirm the program by its classified designation. He said the name Ivy Bells in the context of describing what he had disclosed to Soviet intelligence, a classified program designation that had never appeared in any public document, spoken by a former NSA employee in a recorded conversation with federal investigators, in explicit reference to having provided that information to a foreign power. According to trial records, that moment became the single most powerful piece of evidence the government would present at trial. The agents noted it without changing their approach. The conversation continued. Pelton, having confirmed the central disclosure, provided additional detail about the Vienna meetings and the financial arrangements that had accompanied them. He did not request an attorney, though the agents had informed him of his right to one. On the morning of November 25, 1985, Ronald William Pelton was placed under arrest at his Annapolis residence. He was transported to the FBI's Washington Field Office, formally charged under the espionage statutes, and advised of his rights. When the formal charging process was complete, he made no further statement without counsel present. Karen Pelton was at the home when the arrest was made. People who knew the family in Annapolis described her reaction in the days following as something that resisted simple characterization. It was shock, but not the shock of someone for whom the reality had never taken any shape at all. Whatever she had known or suspected over the years, whatever unexplained absences or evasive answers had accumulated in the ordinary record of their marriage, none of it had been the same thing as FBI agents at the door with handcuffs. The children were informed by their mother within the first day. The arrest was not announced publicly for several days. When it was announced in late November 1985, it generated significant coverage in national news outlets. The case was immediately recognized as serious. A former signals intelligence professional charged with espionage, having worked at one of the most sensitive positions in the American intelligence community. The specific programs he had compromised remained classified, but intelligence professionals who read the coverage understood, from the mention of the NSA and the reference to signals intelligence programs, that something significant had been lost. The federal prosecution of Ronald William Pelton was assigned to the United States District Court for the District of Maryland. The government's case rested primarily on the recording of the November 24th interview. a 4-hour conversation in which Pelton had discussed his espionage in sufficient detail and with sufficient specificity to establish both his participation and his knowledge of the classified programs involved. Supplementing the recording were financial records, documenting unexplained cash Pelton had received during the early 1980s, travel records showing international trips consistent with meetings in Vienna during the relevant period, and expert testimony from intelligence officials addressing the nature and extent of the damage caused by his disclosures. The classification of the programs involved created significant logistical challenges for the prosecution. Presenting sufficient evidence about the nature of the programs Pelton had compromised without making classified information available in an open proceeding required procedures standard in national security cases, closed sessions for portions of testimony involving classified material, cleared personnel for specific roles in the proceeding, and coordination between prosecutors and classification authorities. Judge Herbert Murray of the United States District Court for the District of Maryland presided. Pelton's defense counsel challenged the admissibility of the November 24th recording, arguing that the interview had been conducted in a manner designed to elicit incriminating statements without the protection of counsel, and that Pelton had not fully understood the implications of speaking without legal representation present. Judge Murray reviewed the challenge and admitted the recording. The defense also argued that whatever Pelton had done had been motivated by financial desperation rather than malice toward his country, that he was a desperate man who had made a catastrophic decision at the lowest point of his life, not an ideologically motivated agent who had acted against his country with clear and sustained intent. The argument was not without some factual basis, but it was made against a 4-hour recorded admission of a pattern of espionage conducted over several years. The jury deliberated for approximately 2 days. On June 5th, 1986, the verdict was returned, guilty on all 4 counts of espionage. Pelton showed little visible reaction when it was read. At sentencing on December 16, 1986, Judge Murray addressed both the circumstances that had preceded Pelton's espionage and what the crimes had cost. The Ivy Bells program had represented an extraordinary investment of resources and operational risk. Its intelligence products had been of genuine strategic value to American military planning for a decade. Its compromise had handed the Soviet Union capabilities it could not have otherwise obtained. Pelton had done all of this knowingly, repeatedly, over a period of years, for money. The money was gone. The program was gone. The Navy divers who had risked their operational careers on classified missions in Soviet-patrolled waters were left with nothing to show for it. Ronald William Pelton was sentenced to 3 concurrent terms of life imprisonment, plus an additional 10 years on a 4th count. He was remanded to federal custody immediately. Karen Pelton filed for divorce in 1987. The marriage, which had survived financial collapse, bankruptcy, unemployment, and years of accumulating strain, did not survive an espionage conviction and a life sentence. The divorce was uncontested. Karen returned to her maiden name. The practical circumstances of the family in the months following Pelton's imprisonment were difficult in the immediate material way that the loss of a household's primary income always is, and in the additional way that comes from the public association of a family name with serious federal crime. The coverage of the trial had appeared in national newspapers and identified Pelton by name and location, which meant that it identified his family. Neighbors who had been friendly became uncertain. The social texture of daily life in Annapolis, which had been ordinary before the arrest, became something that required navigation. Karen returned to full-time employment to support herself and the children still living at home. She managed the practical challenges of single parenthood with the pragmatic competence that the situation required. Accounts from people who knew the family in those years describe her as someone who had internalized the necessity of forward movement without the luxury of extended grief or recrimination. There was too much to manage. As the years passed and the case receded from active public attention, it became something present in records and archives rather than in daily social life, something that could be minimized for those who declined to be defined by it. The children processed what had happened to their father along different timelines, shaped by their ages at the time of the arrest. According to accounts from people who knew the family in those years, the period immediately following the arrest was characterized by the kind of domestic upheaval that disrupts the routine structures children depend on. The school morning schedules, the dinner conversations, the ordinary logistics of a household that had, even in its financially stressed form, maintained a recognizable shape. That shape was now gone. The eldest had the capacity to read the trial coverage and form an adult understanding of what their father had done, but that understanding came with its own costs, including the need to reconcile the person they had known as a father with the crimes documented in federal court records. The younger children had less complete comprehension of the legal situation, but experienced its consequences directly. The absence of their father, the disruption to their domestic stability, and the social consequences of an association they had done nothing to earn. Contact between the children and their imprisoned father in the years following the conviction is documented in prison records. Some maintained occasional correspondence or visits during the early years. As time passed and the children built their own adult lives, careers, families of their own, the practical and emotional distance between them and the man serving life sentences became the dominant character of that relationship. It did not disappear entirely, but it never recovered the ordinary texture of a parent-child relationship, and the decades of absence left a kind of damage that correspondence and occasional visits could not undo. The challenge for the Pelton children was one that takes a particular form when the crime involved is espionage rather than an ordinary offense. Other forms of parental incarceration carry stigma, but they do not carry the specific weight of national betrayal, the knowledge that a parent's choices were defined as crimes against the country itself. How a child integrates that knowledge into their sense of their own family, their own name, their own identity, is a question that does not have a standardized answer. The youngest of the Pelton children had the least complete comprehension of what their father had done when the arrest occurred, which meant that understanding arrived later, in pieces, assembled from news archives and eventually from a clear-eyed reading of the trial record. That delayed arrival of full comprehension is its own kind of difficulty. The shock of understanding is not mitigated by distance from the original event, and in some respects is compounded by the realization that the people around them had already processed it long before they had. Ronald Pelton was initially incarcerated at a federal correctional facility. He was subsequently transferred through the federal prison system as his incarceration continued across the years and decades. The prison years were, by the accounts available from people with knowledge of his situation, spent without dramatic incident. He was not a disciplinary problem. He participated in educational programs available at the facilities where he was held. He served his time with what appears, from the available record, to have been an acceptance that the circumstances he was in were the consequences of choices he had made. The outside world transformed around him during those nearly 30 years. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in December 1991, 12 years into his sentence. The Cold War ended. The Ivy Bells program became partially known through investigative journalism and declassified accounts, and the outline of what Pelton had destroyed was gradually assembled in publicly available histories of Cold War signals intelligence. His case was referenced in counterintelligence training materials developed by the FBI and NSA as an example of how human vulnerability, financial desperation, poor judgment, the particular recklessness of someone who felt he had nothing left to lose, could neutralize even the most sophisticated operational security. The case also had a secondary lesson that counterintelligence professionals found instructive. The NSA's investigation had identified Pelton as a probable source within approximately 18 months of the Ivy Bells device being recovered in 1981. The analytical work that narrowed the field to Pelton was sound. What the investigation lacked was the external corroboration necessary to build a prosecutable case. For 4 years, from 1981 to 1985, Ronald Pelton was a known suspect who could not be charged, and during those 4 years he lived without apparent awareness that he was under suspicion. The case ultimately broke, not because the FBI or NSA had assembled sufficient evidence through their own investigative work, but because a senior KGB officer defected and provided the specific operational details that allowed investigators to confront Pelton directly with evidence of their knowledge. Yurchenko's defection was, from the intelligence community's perspective, fortuitous. Whether the case would ever have been resolved without, it remains one of the enduring, unanswerable questions in the history of Cold War counterintelligence. Ronald William Pelton was released on parole in November 2015. He was 74 years old, in declining health, after nearly 30 years in federal custody. He moved to a small residence in the Pacific Northwest. Karen, long since divorced and having rebuilt her life during the preceding decades, had no contact with him. His children, now middle-aged adults with their own families, maintained the distance that the years had established. There were no documented reunions. There were no memoirs, no press interviews, no public effort at narrative reconsideration. He lived quietly and without public profile for the remaining years of his life. The world he had emerged into in November 2015 was one in which the Cold War was taught in history courses, and the specific programs he had compromised were discussed in declassified accounts available in university libraries. The country he had sold secrets to did not exist. The agency he had betrayed had been transformed beyond recognition by the digital revolution. He died in 2022 at the age of 80. The announcements of his death were brief items in online publications covering national security matters, noting the passing of a convicted Cold War spy whose case had been defined by the Ivy Bells disclosure. The obituaries mentioned his sentence and his release. None attempted a comprehensive judgment. The Pelton case has occupied a particular place in the history of American counterintelligence for 4 decades, not because it represents an unusual type of betrayal, but because it illustrates with unusual clarity the gap between the scale of institutional investment and the fragility of individual judgment under pressure. The NSA spent hundreds of millions of dollars across the decade of Ivy Bells' operation. Thousands of people contributed to the program, naval architects and engineers who designed the specialized submarine equipment, Navy divers who performed technically demanding work at considerable depth in cold water, analysts who processed and evaluated the recordings month after month, policy officials who defended the program's budget and classified review settings year after year. The program survived the operational hazards of conducting classified missions in some of the most challenging physical conditions on Earth. It survived a decade's worth of bureaucratic competition for resources within an intelligence community that was never short of competing claims. It produced intelligence that officials consistently characterized as of unique strategic value. None of that survived one phone call. The systemic failures that enabled the espionage were real and were acknowledged by the intelligence community in the reforms that followed. The NSA's post-employment security procedures in 1979 were inadequate to the vulnerability that a financially desperate former SCI cleared employee represented. Once an employee left the agency, their clearance was revoked and the active monitoring of their situation effectively ended. There was no systematic mechanism for identifying former employees who might be experiencing the kind of financial crisis that Pelton's bankruptcy represented, a crisis that, by any counterintelligence analysis, created exactly the kind of vulnerability that adversary intelligence services were specifically trained to find and exploit. In the years following his conviction, the intelligence community implemented enhanced financial disclosure requirements for employees with SCI access, developed post-employment review procedures that created formal mechanisms for monitoring former cleared employees during the period immediately following their departure, and integrated financial vulnerability as a primary indicator of espionage risk into counterintelligence doctrine in ways that had not been formalized before 1985. These reforms did not eliminate insider threats, as subsequent cases would demonstrate, but they reduced the structural gap that the Pelton case had exposed with such stark clarity. The challenge with insider threats is that the conditions that produce them are often indistinguishable from the outside, from the ordinary difficulties of ordinary lives. Pelton's financial crisis looked at every stage of its development like a personal problem rather than a national security problem, a credit card balance, a missed mortgage payment, a bankruptcy filing. These are events that affect millions of Americans and that, in millions of cases, resolve without any security consequence whatsoever. What could not be anticipated was the speed at which personal circumstances could change and the degree to which a person who had been reliable under one set of conditions might make catastrophically different decisions under another. The financial crisis that drove Pelton to the Soviet embassy developed over years in plain sight. Bankruptcy filings are public records. Credit defaults leave paper trails. The departure from the NSA was documented in employment records, and yet no one connected these dots until after the damage was done. The financial dimension of the case has remained, for intelligence professionals and historians, one of the most jarring single facts in the documented history of Cold War espionage. $35,000. The sum is not merely modest in relation to what was provided for it, it is insulting in its modesty. Pelton had no sophisticated sense of what his information was worth to the people he was selling it to. He was not a trained intelligence officer. He did not understand the market for what he possessed. He negotiated, to the extent he negotiated at all, from a position of such profound desperation that he accepted whatever was offered. The KGB, recognizing this, offered him the minimum necessary to maintain the relationship. Whether the officers who handled him understood, in the meetings in Vienna, the full magnitude of what they were receiving is impossible to know. What they understood was that they were receiving sensitive information from a credible source at a price that was, by any reasonable assessment, extraordinarily favorable to the Soviet side. But the systemic failures explained how the espionage was possible, not why it happened. The decision was Pelton's. He had been trusted with access to secrets of extraordinary sensitivity. He had taken oaths that obligated him to protect that access under any circumstances. He had chosen, at a moment of personal crisis and under the influence of alcohol, to treat those secrets as a commodity that might solve his financial problems. He had then perpetuated that choice across multiple meetings and years of contact, traveling to Vienna, meeting with handlers, disclosing additional information in exchange for additional payments. The question of motivation in cases like this is one that investigators, analysts, and historians return to again and again without finding answers that feel fully satisfying. Espionage for money, as opposed to espionage driven by ideology, a coercion, or divided national loyalty, presents a particular challenge to retrospective moral understanding because money is simultaneously the most comprehensible of motivations and the most obviously disproportionate when weighed against the consequences. People understand debt. People understand desperation. What is harder to understand is how a person moves, step by step, from a financial problem to a decision to call the Soviet embassy, how the distance between those 2 points, which looks enormous from the outside, becomes traversable from the inside. The available record of Pelton's statements during his FBI debriefings and his trial does not suggest that he was driven by ideological sympathy with the Soviet Union or by any coherent political worldview that led him to conclude that his country's adversaries deserved to understand its intelligence capabilities. He was not, in the available evidence, a man who had spent years developing a critique of American foreign policy that eventually expressed itself in espionage. He was a man who had spent years developing a debt problem that eventually expressed itself in espionage. The financial desperation was real. The alcohol was real. The particular vulnerability of someone who had built a professional identity around the handling of sensitive secrets, who knew what he knew, who had observed the value of that knowledge for 14 years, combined with the desperation to produce a decision that, in a different state of mind, he might not have made. Whether that context diminishes or complicates the moral assessment of what he did is a question that admits different answers depending on the values one brings to the analysis. The legal assessment was straightforward. He had violated clear statutory prohibitions, and the penalties were correspondingly severe. The human assessment is more complicated, and the complications do not resolve into comfort. The human cost of the case landed almost entirely on people who bore no responsibility for the decisions that produced it. Karen Pelton had not made Ronald's financial choices. She had not encouraged the drinking. She had not counseled the phone call to the Soviet embassy. She spent the better part of a decade managing the fallout from choices she had not made, the financial hardship, the social stigma, the challenge of raising children who needed stability while their domestic world was destabilized, the slow and difficult work of building a life that her husband's espionage had upended. The children carried into adulthood an association with their father's crimes that they had done nothing to earn, and from which they could not entirely separate themselves, however completely they lived their own lives apart from it. There is also the category of people who are never named in any account of a case like this. The analysts at Fort Meade, who processed the Ivy Bells tapes for a decade, who did their work with the understanding that it mattered, and who continued to do it after the program's loss without knowing why the recordings had stopped. The submarine crews who risked their operational careers on classified missions in Soviet-patrolled waters, whose achievement was disclosed to the adversary before many of them had retired. The engineers who spent years developing the recording device and the specialized equipment that made the dives possible, whose work produced something that ended up in a museum in Moscow. None of these people appear in the formal accounting of what Ronald Pelton's espionage cost, because the accounting is conducted in dollars and strategic assessments, rather than in the human currency of effort, risk, and the particular injury of discovering that what you built has been given away by someone who was trusted to protect it. The Ivy Bells device sits in a museum in Moscow. The cable it once tapped no longer carries Soviet military communications. The recording pods that Navy divers had retrieved at depth, in cold water, in the dark of the Sea of Okhotsk, are the stuff of partially declassified Cold War history. The program that assembled them, that identified the cable from a warning sign on a satellite photograph, that converted a retired submarine, that trained divers to work at depth in conditions that tolerated almost no error, that collected a decade of raw Soviet Pacific Fleet communications and delivered them to analysts who turned them into intelligence, exists now only in histories, training materials, and the recollections of people who were cleared to work on it and who mostly remained silent about what it produced. Ronald Pelton was 38 years old when he made the call. He was 80 years old when he died. In between, he collected $35,000, gave away a billion-dollar intelligence operation, served nearly 30 years in federal prison, lost his marriage, lost his children's daily presence in his life, and outlived by decades both the country whose secrets he had sold and the country he had sold them to. The bourbon was long gone. The telephone directory was landfill. The checking account had been seized and settled and closed, and what remained, when the account was finally totaled, was a number so small in relation to the cost that it defied the ordinary arithmetic of consequence. $35,000, given away everything else.